Hannah's heart pounded against her ribcage as she inched closer to the open window, the cold evening breeze biting against her skin. The bandages on her wounded hand threatened to unravel, and she bit her lower lip, steeling herself against the sharp sting of pain. One step, then another. She could hear faint voices from downstairs, muffled laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of conversation. They hadn't noticed she was missing yet. The sun had barely set, leaving the sky painted in hues of deep purple and burnt orange. Shadows stretched across the vast estate, and with them came a sense of urgency. Time was running out. She exhaled shakily, gripping the window frame tighter with her good hand. If she hesitated now, she would lose her chance. Hanna was about to lower herself down when, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The deep voice sliced through the air like a whip, sending a violent shiver down her spine. Her breath hitched, and her gaze snapped downward. Standing beneath her was a man, his muscular frame partially hidden in the dim light. He was leaning against the wall, cigarette hanging loosely from his lips, his thick brows furrowed as his sharp eyes locked onto her, assessing her every move. The moment their gazes met, a foreign kind of fear coursed through her veins. Andrian. She clenched her fists, pressing herself against the cool exterior of the house. His presence alone was enough to suffocate her. But it wasn't just fear. There was something else, something dark and unexplainable lurking in those piercing eyes of his. The wind howled suddenly, lifting the hem of her dress. Hannah's eyes widened in horror as she struggled to keep the fabric down. "Damn it," Andrian smirked, an infuriatingly arrogant expression crossing his features. "Well, this is quite the view," he mused, his voice laced with amusement. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. What are you doing?" "Stop looking, you pervert!" she shrieked, twisting her body away from his gaze. His smirk only deepened. "I'd love to, sweetheart, but if I close my eyes, you might fall. And while watching you stumble would be entertaining, I doubt you'd appreciate the landing." Hanna gritted her teeth. She wanted to strangle him. Or better yet, vanish into thin air. She tried to regain her composure, but Andrian's dark gaze bore into her, making her skin prickle. This wasn't just any man. This was Andrian de Vera, dangerous, unpredictable, and completely impossible to outmaneuver. Her escape plan was crumbling before her eyes, and she wasn't sure if she would survive whatever came next. Hannah's breath hitched as Andrian exhaled a slow stream of smoke, his sharp eyes still locked on her trembling form. She felt the weight of his gaze pressing against her skin, burning hotter than the cold night air. "You gonna jump or just keep standing there?" he mused, the ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. Her hands clenched around the window frame, knuckles white with tension. "Shut up," she hissed, trying to steady her shaking legs. A dark chuckle rumbled in his chest. "Feisty." Hanna turned away from him, swallowing hard. She needed to move, now, but her injured hand made it difficult to grip the ledge, and she cursed under her breath. She had barely adjusted her footing when a sharp gust of wind whipped past her, making her lose balance. The moment her foot slipped, a gasp tore from her lips. Before she could even register what was happening, strong arms caught her midair. The impact sent a jolt through her body as she landed against a hard chest. The familiar scent of smoke and something distinctly him wrapped around her, sending her senses into chaos. Andrian held her firm, his grip possessive, unyielding. "Are you always this reckless? Or is this a special performance just for me?" he murmured, his lips dangerously close to her ear. Hanna stiffened, pushing against his chest, but he didn't budge. "Let me go," she spat, her voice shaking. He tilted his head slightly, amusement flickering in his eyes. "You're bleeding," he noted, his gaze flicking to her bandaged hand. She jerked away from him, finally finding her footing. "It's none of your business," she said through gritted teeth. Andrian took a long drag of his cigarette before exhaling, the smoke curling in the air between them. Everything about you is my business, he said, his voice lower this time. Hanna's heart pounded violently against her ribs. This was bad. Andrian was dangerous in ways that went beyond fists and threats. Because unlike others, he didn't just break bones, he shattered souls. And she was terrified he'd break hers next. Hanna sat stiffly in the leather chair, her hands gripping the armrests like a lifeline. The grand estate loomed around her, suffocating in its silence. Across from her, Andrian leaned against the table, arms crossed, his sharp gaze never leaving her. "You really thought you could run?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Hanna swallowed, her throat dry. "I had to try." A slow, dark smirk spread across his lips. "And where exactly were you planning to go, Hanna? Do you have a place to run to? Someone to protect you?" The words cut deep, slashing through her fragile hopes. He was right. She had nowhere to go. No family, no home, nothing but a past she was desperately trying to outrun. Andrian took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "You can hate me all you want, but you're not leaving." Hanna's nails dug into her palms. "Why do you even care?" she demanded, her voice laced with frustration and desperation. "I'm nothing to you." His jaw tensed, and for the briefest second, something flickered in his gaze, something she couldn't name. Then, just as quickly, it vanished. "You're right," he said smoothly. "You're nothing." Hanna's breath caught in her throat. He walked past her, but before leaving the room, he murmured, "And yet, here you are, still mine to keep." The door clicked shut behind him, and with it, Hanna felt the last shred of her freedom slip through her fingers. She was trapped. And the worst part? A part of her feared she might never want to leave. Hanna avoided Andrian for days, sticking to the farthest corners of the estate. She convinced herself that if she stayed quiet, invisible, maybe, just maybe, he'd forget about her. But Andrian de Vera wasn't the type to forget. And on the fifth night, he proved just that. Hanna was curled up in bed when the door creaked open. A tall shadow loomed over her before she had the chance to react. Andrian. Before she could finish, he reached down, gripping her chin between his fingers. His touch was firm, almost gentle, but the fire in his eyes was anything but. "You've been avoiding me," he murmured. Hanna's breath caught. His proximity was suffocating, stealing every rational thought from her mind. She turned her face away, but he didn't let go. "I don't belong here," she whispered. A dark chuckle escaped his lips. "You think you have a choice?" He leaned in, his lips just inches from hers. "Whether you like it or not, Hanna, you're mine." The words sent a violent shudder through her body. Because despite everything, despite the fear, the resentment, the hatred, something inside her whispered that she had already been his all along. Hanna wanted to pretend that Andrian's words hadn't sunk into her bones. "You're mine." But they had. She told herself it was fear, nothing more. That the way his voice wrapped around her, the way his touch lingered even when he wasn't there, meant nothing. And yet, the thought of him still clung to her like smoke. Late that night, she sat by the large window, staring at the endless darkness outside. She traced the bandages on her wounded hand, reminding herself why she had tried to run. She had to get out. This wasn't a home. This was a prison. A prison with a captor who made her heart race in ways it shouldn't. Just as she was about to close the window, the door creaked open. She turned, and there he was. Andrian leaned against the frame, arms crossed, eyes smoldering. Thinking of escaping again? Hanna's throat tightened. "You can't keep me here forever." A slow, dark smirk stretched across his lips. "You're right, but tell me, where will you go? Back to the streets? Back to being nothing?" She flinched. It wasn't his words that hurt. It was the truth in them. Andrian stepped closer, his voice softer but no less lethal. You don't have to run, Hanna. Not from me. She swallowed hard. Why do you even care? Silence. Then, I don't, he said, but the flicker of something in his gaze told her otherwise. And that terrified her more than anything. Days passed, and Andrian remained a constant presence, haunting her every move. At first, she hated it. The way his eyes followed her, the way he spoke her name like it belonged to him. But then, something shifted. One evening, she found herself in the estate's library, a place she thought would be empty. But Andrian was already there, lounging on the couch, a book resting on his lap. She hesitated, ready to leave, but his voice stopped her. Sit, he commanded. She exhaled sharply. I wasn't planning on staying. He didn't look up. I wasn't asking. Hanna clenched her fists but sat on the farthest chair. Silence stretched between them. Minutes passed, then an hour. She didn't realize she had started watching him. The way his fingers flipped through pages, the way his lips twitched slightly in amusement at something he read. And then, as if he could feel her gaze, he looked up. Their eyes locked. A challenge, a warning, and something deeper. Something neither of them was ready to name. Hanna was beginning to understand something dangerous. Andrian wasn't just cruel. He wasn't just possessive. He was lonely. And that made him far more dangerous than she had ever realized. One night, she found herself in the kitchen, restless and unable to sleep. As she reached for a glass of water, a voice cut through the silence. You're up late. She turned, startled. Andrian leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her. She sighed. I couldn't sleep. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Why? Hanna hesitated, then spoke before she could stop herself. Because of you. A flicker of something flashed in his eyes. Then, he was right in front of her, his hand tilting her chin up. What about me keeps you awake, Hanna? Her pulse thundered. I don't know. And maybe that was the scariest part. The next time Andrian cornered her, it wasn't just words. It was something else entirely. Hanna was in the garden when she felt him approach before she even saw him. His presence was like a storm, unpredictable, uncontrollable. He reached for her wrist, his grip firm but not painful. I don't like it when you avoid me. She tried to pull away. And I don't like it when you act like you own me. His jaw tightened. I don't act like anything, Hanna. The intensity in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. She hated this. She hated that a part of her was drawn to him, to the way he looked at her, the way his voice wrapped around her like a promise and a threat all at once. You can't control me, she whispered. Andrian's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile. Can't I? Before she could react, he tugged her closer, their bodies nearly touching. Hanna's breath caught. Let go. His fingers brushed over her wrist, featherlight. Tell me to stop. She should have. But the words wouldn't come. And that was the moment she realized. This wasn't just a battle of wills. This was a war. And she had no idea which one of them would win. Hanna tried to ignore the lingering sensation of Andrian's touch. She told herself it was nothing, just another moment of his control, another way he was toying with her. But at night, when the mansion was quiet, she couldn't forget. The way his voice had dipped lower, the way his fingers had traced the inside of her wrist, the way he had dared her to stop him, and she hadn't. She was losing control. She needed distance. That morning, she tried to avoid him, but the house seemed smaller when she was trying to escape him. At breakfast, he sat across from her, casually sipping his coffee, eyes locked on her like he knew exactly what she was thinking. You look tired, he said, voice smooth, knowing. Hanna set down her fork. Maybe because someone keeps invading my space. His lips curved. You're the one who keeps running, Hanna. Makes me wonder, are you running from me? Or from yourself? Her stomach clenched, because she didn't have an answer. Later that day, Hanna found herself in the hallway, standing by a large window, watching the rain pour outside. She needed air, space. But before she could step away, she felt him. Andrian was close, his presence consuming. "You keep running," he murmured, his voice a dangerous whisper, "but you never get far." She turned, meeting his gaze, her heart pounding. "You don't own me," she shot back. Something dark flickered in his eyes. He stepped closer, and she had nowhere to go. The cold window pressed against her back. Andrian raised a hand, his fingers grazing her cheek, his touch feather-light, like he was testing a boundary neither of them fully understood. "You sure about that?" he asked, his voice softer now, more intimate. Hanna swallowed hard. "This isn't a game, Andrian." His lips barely moved, but she could feel the smirk in his words. "Who said I was playing?" The tension thickened, heavy, suffocating. For a second, just a second, she let herself imagine what it would feel like if she stopped resisting. But that wasn't an option. Not when the fire between them was just as dangerous as the past they were both trying to outrun. Hanna didn't see him for the rest of the day. But that night, she heard him. She had gone to bed early, exhausted from fighting emotions she didn't want to feel. Then, a door creaked, a deep exhale, a quiet presence in the dark. She knew it was him. She turned, her breath catching as she saw him standing in the doorway, shirt unbuttoned, his silhouette sharp against the dim light from the hall. "Andrian," she whispered, heart hammering, "what are you doing?" He didn't move. "I should be asking you that," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "lying here, pretending you don't think about me." Hanna clenched her fists under the covers. "You're insane." He smirked. "Maybe." The room was too quiet, too charged. "You need to leave," she said, voice unsteady. Andrian tilted his head, studying her. "Do I?" She hated him. Hated the way he made her feel like she was unraveling. Hated that a part of her didn't want him to go. But before she could speak, he did something she didn't expect. He turned and left, leaving her drowning in emotions she refused to name. Days passed, but the storm between them didn't calm. It only grew. The more Hanna tried to avoid him, the more he found her. The more she tried to push him away, the more he pulled her back. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Then, one evening, it all came crashing down. She was in the hallway when she heard voices, low, tense. Andrian's voice. She followed the sound, peeking into a dimly lit room where Andrian stood, speaking to a man she didn't recognize. "I don't need your warnings," Andrian was saying, his voice laced with something dangerous. "I know exactly what I'm doing." The man exhaled sharply. "Do you?" Andrian's jaw tightened. "Stay out of it." Hanna's chest tightened. There was something about the way Andrian spoke, something almost vulnerable. Like he was losing control, just like her. Before she could move, Andrian turned, and their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice quieter than she had ever heard from him, he asked, "How long have you been standing there?" Hanna's pulse pounded. "Long enough," she whispered. And in that moment, she knew. Whatever was happening between them, it was far from over. Hanna's world was spiraling. No matter how hard she tried to distance herself, Andrian was everywhere, pulling her into something she wasn't ready for. Something she couldn't name. That night, she sat by the fireplace, staring into the flickering flames, trying to silence the thoughts racing through her mind. Then, she felt it. That unmistakable presence. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. "Andrian," she murmured. His footsteps were slow, deliberate. "You always say my name like it's a problem," he said, voice smooth, teasing. "Maybe because you are," she shot back, still not looking at him. Silence stretched between them. Then, suddenly, she felt him, his warmth just behind her. "You're afraid of something," he mused, his breath ghosting over her skin. "And it's not me." Hanna swallowed hard. He was right. And that terrified her more than anything. It happened too fast. One moment, she was walking down the hall, lost in thought. The next, a strong hand grabbed her wrist, pulling her into the shadows. She gasped, heart racing. "What the?" Before she could finish, her back hit the cold wall, and Andrian's face was inches from hers. "Tell me to let go," he challenged, voice low, controlled. Hanna's breath hitched. Tell him to let go. Tell him to step back. Tell him to stop. But she couldn't. Because a part of her didn't want him to. His fingers brushed her jaw, tilting her face up. "You're always running, but you never leave," he murmured. She clenched her fists. "Because I can't." His lips barely parted, as if he wanted to say something. But then, the moment shattered. A voice called out from down the hall. And just like that, he was gone, leaving her breathless, shaken, and wanting more. Days passed, but the tension between them only thickened. They spoke in glances, fought in silence, and danced around something neither dared to name. Then, one evening, as the storm raged outside, it finally broke. Hanna was in the library, running her fingers over the spines of old books, when Andrian's voice cut through the quiet. "You've been avoiding me." She turned, eyes meeting his. "Maybe I needed space." His jaw tightened. "Liar." Something inside her snapped. "You think you know everything, don't you?" she hissed. Andrian took a step closer. "I know you feel this." She shook her head. "I feel nothing." The words barely left her lips before he moved, closing the space between them in an instant. His hands caged her in, one resting on the bookshelf behind her, the other grazing her waist. "You're a terrible liar," he whispered. The fire between them burned too hot, too fast. And in that moment, she knew. Whatever this was, it was already too late to stop. That night, Hanna couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Andrian's words echoing in her head. "You feel this. You're a terrible liar." With a frustrated sigh, she threw off the covers and stepped onto the balcony. The night air was cool, crisp, a stark contrast to the heat simmering inside her. Then, a deep voice shattered the silence. "You shouldn't be out here alone." She turned sharply. Andrian stood by the railing, his face partially hidden by shadows. "You're everywhere," she muttered. His lips twitched. "You say that like it's a bad thing." She exhaled. "It is." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, softly, almost too softly, he asked, "What are you so afraid of, Hanna?" She wanted to answer. Wanted to tell him everything. But instead, she turned, stepping back inside. Because some truths were too heavy to bear. Hanna had spent years building walls, strong, impenetrable, safe. But Andrian? He was tearing them down with nothing but a look. She should have known better than to let herself be caught alone with him again. Yet here she was, in the dimly lit corridor, his towering presence caging her in. His fingers traced the edge of the bookshelf beside her, his touch deliberate. "You keep running," he murmured, "but you never tell me why." Hanna clenched her fists. "Maybe I just don't want to be near you." A slow smirk tugged at his lips. "Liar." The air between them crackled. And then, a door slammed somewhere in the house. Footsteps echoed down the hall. Hanna seized the moment to slip away, but just as she turned, Andrian's fingers brushed her wrist, a touch so fleeting, yet it set fire to her skin. "Careful, Hanna," he whispered, his voice dangerously soft. "One day, you won't want to run anymore." And as she walked away, heart hammering, she feared he might be right. That evening, a storm raged outside, mirroring the chaos in Hanna's mind. She stood by the window, watching the rain pound against the glass. And then, a voice cut through the silence. "You look like a ghost standing there." She turned sharply. Andrian leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His gaze darkened. "Because you can't seem to decide if you want me gone." Her breath caught. He took slow, deliberate steps toward her, stopping just close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Tell me to leave," he challenged. She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. The storm howled outside, but inside, it was nothing compared to the whirlwind between them. "Thought so," he murmured, before turning on his heel and walking away, leaving her breathless, confused, and aching in a way she didn't understand. Hanna had spent most of her life avoiding the past. But some ghosts refused to stay buried. She stood outside the grand estate, the weight of old memories pressing down on her. And then, a presence. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. "You shouldn't be here," Andrian said, his voice quieter than usual. "I had no choice." His jaw clenched. "There's always a choice." She exhaled. "Not for me." Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, he spoke. "If you don't want to tell me, fine," he said, his tone deceptively light. "But one day, Hanna, you're going to have to stop pretending you don't trust me." And just like that, he walked away, leaving her with the painful realization that he might be the only person who truly saw her. It happened in the dead of night. Hanna had gone to the library, desperate for a distraction. But she wasn't alone. Andrian was there, sitting in the leather chair, a book open in his lap, but his eyes were on her the moment she stepped inside. "You can't sleep either?" he asked. She hesitated. "No." He nodded, as if he understood. She wasn't sure what made her walk toward him, but the next thing she knew, she was standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames. Then, a whisper of movement, a shift in the air. And suddenly, he was behind her, so close she could feel his breath against her hair. "You should go," she murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. Andrian exhaled. "Tell me to." She swallowed hard. And then, before she could stop herself, she turned, and in that moment, whatever had been simmering between them finally erupted. His hands found her waist, her fingers tangled in his shirt. The firelight flickered, casting shadows against the walls. And for the first time in a long time, Hanna wasn't thinking. She was feeling. Hanna should have walked away. Every warning in her head screamed at her to stop, to leave before she lost herself completely. But Andrian was too close. His hands rested lightly at her waist, his grip neither possessive nor forceful, just steady, as if he were waiting for her to make a choice. The flickering firelight cast shadows over his sharp features, making the intensity in his eyes seem even darker. "Tell me you don't want this," he murmured. Hanna opened her mouth, but nothing came. And then, his thumb brushed her cheek, trailing down slowly, deliberately, until it rested just below her chin. A shiver ran through her. "You can't, can you?" he whispered. She hated that he was right. And when he leaned in, so painfully slow that it felt like torture, her breath hitched. But just before their lips met, a loud knock at the door shattered the moment. Hanna jerked away as if burned, heart hammering. Andrian exhaled sharply, closing his eyes for a brief second before turning toward the door. She used the distraction to slip away. But even as she hurried down the hallway, trying to put as much distance between them as possible, the warmth of his touch still lingered on her skin. Hanna avoided Andrian for days. She threw herself into work, into distractions, into anything that kept her mind off what almost happened. But she could still feel it. Every stolen glance, Every moment their paths crossed, it was unbearable. And then, one evening, she found herself outside, the cool air wrapping around her like a cloak. She leaned against the balcony railing, exhaling softly. "You're running again." Her breath caught. Andrian stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching her with that same unreadable intensity. "I'm not running," she lied. He took a slow step forward. "Then why won't you look at me?" Hanna turned away. "Because this, whatever this is, it's a mistake." Andrian didn't answer immediately. And then, maybe, his voice was quiet, but if it is, it's the only one that's ever felt right. Her heart clenched, because deep down, she knew he was right. The tension between them had become unbearable. Hanna was losing control. And Andrian? He wasn't letting her go so easily. That night, when she finally gathered the courage to face him, she found him in the study, leaning against the bookshelf, arms crossed. He was expecting her. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Andrian's eyes softened. "Then let me decide for you." She shook her head. "I can't. Before she could finish, he closed the distance between them, his hand cupping her face. "Hanna," he murmured, voice full of something that made her knees weak. And then, he kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't demanding. It was slow, intense, as if he had all the time in the world. Hanna had spent years building walls. And with one kiss, Andrian shattered them all. Hanna knew she should have stopped. But as Andrian's lips moved against hers, she forgot every reason why. His hands slid to her waist, pulling her closer, and for once, she didn't resist. She let herself feel. Let herself want. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. But then, a voice from the hallway. A sharp knock on the door. Reality crashed down on her like a tidal wave. Hanna pulled away, breathless, heart pounding. Andrian's eyes searched hers. But before he could speak, she whispered, "This can't happen." And before he could stop her, she walked away, leaving behind a man who looked like he was just starting to believe in something again. And leaving behind a part of herself she wasn't sure she'd ever get back. Hanna didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind looping through every stolen moment with Andrian. His touch, his voice, his lips against hers. Everything about him felt dangerous. But what terrified her the most was that, deep down, she didn't want to run anymore. She wanted him. But wanting Andrian came with consequences, ones she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Morning came too soon. She dragged herself out of bed, forcing herself into the motions of normalcy. But no amount of pretending could erase the weight pressing against her chest. Andrian was waiting for her downstairs. He stood by the window, his back to her, the morning light casting long shadows across the room. She should have turned around. She should have walked away. Instead, she whispered, "Andrian." He turned. The moment their eyes met, everything unraveled. Without a word, he closed the distance between them, his hand reaching for hers. His touch was warm, grounding. "Hanna," he said softly. Her throat tightened. "We can't do this," she said, but the words were weak, unconvincing. Andrian tilted his head, studying her. "Then tell me you don't feel the same way." She opened her mouth, but no words came. Because lying to herself was impossible. And he knew it. Andrian took another step closer, his hands gently cradling her face. His thumb brushed over her cheek, slow and deliberate. "Tell me to stop, Hanna." Her breath hitched. Tell him to stop. Push him away. But instead, she closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoy the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.